She was carrying 3 plates in someone else's dreams when the most dangerous man in Sicily walked through the door. The restaurant went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something predatory enters. She didn't flinch. She didn't move aside. She looked him dead in the eye and told him his table wasn't ready. He laughed. It was the last time he would ever laugh at her, because in the space of one heartbeat, something cracked open inside Dante Ferraro that 30 years of iron discipline had never once touched. And neither of them would ever be the same again. Welcome, besties. This story is about to take you somewhere dangerous, romantic, and completely addictive. Please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who loves a good story. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to know. Now, let's begin. The night started, the way most life-changing nights do, ordinary and a little bit exhausting. Angela Moreau had been on her feet for 11 hours. 11 hours of balancing plates, managing complaints, pouring wine for people who looked right through her, and smiling through every single second of it because the tips paid her mother's physical therapy bills, and she didn't have the luxury of a bad attitude. She worked at Osteria Ferrante, one of the oldest dining establishments in Palermo, Sicily, the kind of place where the walls were older than most governments and the menu hadn't changed since 1971. The owner, a rotund man named Signor Barsetti, ran it with a fist made of anxiety and pasta dough. Angela had worked there for 3 years. She knew every crack in the terracotta floor. She knew which chair wobbled near table 7. She knew which regulars tipped generously and which ones left coins and excuses. What she didn't know, not yet, was that tonight would divide her life cleanly in 2, before and after. She was crossing the dining room with a tray balanced on one arm and a bread basket tucked in the crook of the other, when the front door opened and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. People noticed. You couldn't help but notice. It wasn't the black suits or the 4 large men who entered first and positioned themselves with military precision around the entrance. It wasn't even the quiet that fell over the dining room, like a curtain dropping. It was him. Dante Ferraro was 41 years old. He had dark hair that was starting to silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved specifically to hold tension. He was tall in a way that the room seemed to shrink around him. His suit was charcoal, expensive, tailored to within a breath of his frame. His eyes were the color of old stone, gray, nearly colorless, and absolutely, terrifyingly still. He moved through the entrance the way powerful men always do, without hurry, without permission, without any apparent awareness that anyone else occupied the same space. The room simply rearranged itself around him. Angela saw him from across the dining room. She registered him the way you register a change in weather, not dramatic, not immediate, just something shifting in the atmosphere. She set down her tray at table 4, delivered the bread basket, smiled at the couple who thanked her, and turned back toward the hostess stand. That was where things went sideways. Marco, the hostess, was 17 and terrified. He was pressing himself against a reservation podium like he was trying to become part of the furniture, staring at the man in the charcoal suit with the look of someone who had forgotten how to form sentences. The 4 bodyguards had taken positions. One was already at the corner table, the best table in the house, pulling out chairs. The problem was that table was already reserved for the next 40 minutes. For a couple celebrating their 35th anniversary, who were currently parking their car 2 streets over. Angela crossed the floor. She stopped between the bodyguards and the table, tray tucked under her arm, and looked directly at the man in the charcoal suit. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was steady because she had learned a long time ago that her voice was the only thing she had full control over. "That table is reserved for the next hour. I can seat your party at table 9 while you wait, or I can call ahead to our partner restaurant on Via." The man looked at her. The looking lasted a moment too long, not the dismissive glance she was expecting. The kind, powerful men gave service staff a flicker of the eyes that confirmed your presence and simultaneously dismissed it. This was something else. He looked at her the way people look at things that surprise them. Then one corner of his mouth lifted. It wasn't kind. It was the faint smile of a man who found a situation mildly entertaining the way a lion might find a house cat entertaining. One of his men stepped forward. Signor Ferraro doesn't wait, the man said, his voice low and flat. The table will be made available. Angela didn't move. She turned to the bodyguard with the same polite, immovable expression she used on every customer who believed the rules didn't apply to them. The couple who reserved this table had been married 35 years. They booked 3 weeks ago. I understand your employer is accustomed to certain accommodations, but I'm going to ask you to give me a few minutes to sort this out properly. The bodyguard stared at her. Dante Ferraro laughed. It was a short, quiet sound, not cruel exactly, but dismissive in a way that only people who have never been told no can be dismissive. He said something in Sicilian to his man, something Angela half caught because her grandmother had spoken it on Sunday mornings. Something about courage and foolishness sharing the same face. The bodyguard stepped aside. Angela didn't understand why. She turned back toward Marco to sort the reservation situation and missed a moment when Dante Ferraro's expression changed. The moment when the amusement faded and something else moved behind those stone-gray eyes. Something quieter. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time, and therefore didn't immediately recognize. The next 20 minutes were a careful negotiation that somehow ended with Signor Barsetti personally escorting the Ferraro party to a private dining room at the back that was technically reserved for large functions, and which now smelled of fresh flowers because someone had run out and purchased them from the florist next door at 11 o'clock at night. The anniversary couple was upgraded to table one by the window, received a complimentary bottle of the restaurant's best Nero d'Avola, and left 3 hours later, calling it the best dinner of their marriage. Angela didn't see any of that. She was in the kitchen restocking when Signor Barsetti found her, sweating through his collar, his face the particular shade of red that indicated he was caught between fury and relief. "Do you know who that is?" he hissed. "A customer," she said. "Angela." He gripped the edge of the counter. "That is Dante Ferraro. Do you understand me? Dante Ferraro." She understood what the name meant in Palermo. Everyone did. The Ferraro family had run the city's underworld for 3 generations. Not loudly, not with violence for its own sake. The way old, powerful things run. Quietly, completely, with a kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Dante was the youngest Don in the family's history. He was also, by most accounts, the most effective. Angela processed this information, then went back to restocking the bread rolls. "He wants to speak with you," Signor Barsetti added. She stopped. "He what?" He asked for the waitress, who told him to wait. Barsetti mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "By name. He asked Marco for your name." Angela set down the bread basket, slowly. She thought about the evening ahead of her, the stack of bills on her kitchen table, the sound her mother made some mornings when the pain was bad, and she tried to hide it, the way she had promised herself at 23, standing in the doorway of the hospital, that she would not be afraid of anything that could be solved with work and nerve. "Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes," she said. The private dining room was quieter than the rest of the restaurant. The bodyguards were stationed outside the door. Inside, Dante Ferraro sat alone at a table set for 12, his jacket still perfectly pressed, a glass of wine untouched in front of him. He looked up when she entered. Angela stood at a professional distance. "You wanted to speak with me." "Sit down," he said. "I'm working." He studied her for a moment. Then he gestured at the chair across from him. "Please." It was such an unexpected word from him, so carefully placed that she sat. He looked at her the way she caught him looking at her before, not with the casual assessment of a man cataloging a woman's appearance, but with something more precise. The way a person looks when they're trying to understand something that doesn't fit their existing categories. "You weren't afraid," he said. "Of what?" "Of me." Angela considered this. "I was afraid my couple was going to lose their anniversary dinner," she said. That felt more urgent. Something moved across his face. Gone before she could name it. "Who are they to you?" "People who deserve to celebrate something good." She paused. "That's enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name is Dante Ferraro." "I know," she said. "What can I get you, Mr. Ferraro?" He almost smiled again. This time it was different, slower, reaching the edges of his eyes in a way the earlier version hadn't. "A reservation," he said. "Next Saturday. For 8." I'll let the hostess know, she said and stood. Your name, he said as she turned. Angela, she said, without looking back. She walked out of the private dining room and stood for 3 full seconds in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, her hands perfectly still. Her heart was doing something it had no business doing. She pressed it flat with pure will, smoothed her apron, and walked back onto the floor. She didn't know that in the room behind her, Dante Ferraro was still watching the door she'd walked through, that his untouched wine was still untouched, that one of his men, Enzo, who had served him for 12 years and learned to read him the way sailors read currents, took one look at his boss's face and filed the name Angela quietly away in part of his mind, reserved for things that mattered. The following Saturday, the reservation for 8 arrived at 7 o'clock precisely. Dante Ferraro was one of the 8. Angela noticed. She was good at noticing. It was part of the work. Tracking tables, reading moods, anticipating needs. She noticed that he took the seat that faced the door. She noticed that he ordered without looking at the menu, which meant he'd reviewed it in advance. She noticed that the conversation at his table, business from a fragment she caught, stopped entirely when she approached and resumed only once she'd moved away. She noticed that he watched her, not obtrusively, not with anything that could be called obvious attention. But twice she turned unexpectedly, moving between tables, and caught the edge of his gaze before he redirected it to his companion. The second time their eyes met for a fraction of a second longer than accidental. Angela carried the moment to the back kitchen and set it down very carefully and left it there. At the end of the evening, she found an envelope on the table after the Ferraro party had cleared out. She assumed it was a tip. She opened it in the hallway. Inside was a card, plain white, heavy stock, a single phone number embossed in black. No name, no instruction, just a number and, written in angular, deliberate handwriting in the corner, a single word. Dinner. She stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she tucked the card into her apron pocket and told herself she was going to throw it away when she got home. She did not throw it away. A few days later, the trouble started. It came in the form of a man named Riccardo Mancini, which was fitting because trouble in Palermo often did arrive wearing an expensive jacket and a familiar name. Mancini was the eldest son of a rival family, younger than Dante by 10 years, and currently engaged in a very particular kind of campaign. Not war. Something quieter. Acquisition. He was buying up restaurants, properties, businesses along the Via Vittorio, pushing out the old establishments to build something newer, more profitable, and entirely his. Osteria Ferrante was on his list. Angela learned this on a Tuesday when Riccardo Mancini walked into the restaurant at 11 in the morning, while they were still setting up for the lunch service, and sat down at table 1 without being invited and ordered an espresso. She brought it herself because Marco was in the back. He was handsome in an obvious way, the kind of handsome that knew itself. He had dark eyes that moved over her with frank appreciation that crossed a line into something less comfortable. He smiled. His teeth were very white. You must be the famous Angela, he said. She set the espresso down. Is there something else I can get you? Information, he said, still smiling, about the property. Whether Barsetti has considered offers. He leaned back in the chair with the ease of a man who owned whatever room he walked into. And about you, perhaps, who you are, what you want. The smile widened, what it would take. Angela looked at him the way she looked at everything she had decided not to be intimidated by, steadily, with complete calm. I'll let Signor Barsetti know you'd like to speak with him about the property, she said. Is there anything else? He reached forward and set his hand lightly on her wrist. It lasted less than a second. She stepped back smoothly, the way she learned to navigate uncomfortable situations in 11 years of working in customer service. The movement so practiced, it looked almost choreographed. Nothing dramatic. Just a clear, quiet no. She didn't know that at that precise moment, a black car was idling across the street, and the man in the back seat had a clear line of sight to the restaurant's front window. Enzo lowered his phone 2 seconds after photographing the scene. He glanced in the rearview mirror at his employer. Dante Ferraro's face had gone very still, not the stillness of calm, the stillness of something held in check. Who is he? Dante said, Riccardo Mancini. Enzo said, Valentino Mancini's eldest. The pause that followed was brief and heavy. Follow him, Dante said. When he leaves, I want to know everything about his current business in this neighborhood. Enzo did not ask why. He had been watching his employer's expression for 12 years. He did not need to ask why. That evening, Angela found a box on the staff entrance step when she finished her shift. A plain wooden box, no note, no bow. Inside was a bottle of the most expensive olive oil she had ever seen in her life, the kind from a family estate in Umbria that was sold in exactly 3 shops in all of Sicily, and a set of 3 chef's knives and a leather roll, the kind that professional cooks spent years saving for. No card, no message. She looked at the box for a long time. Then she looked up and down the dark street. She carried the box home because she didn't know what else to do with it, and told herself she would figure out who had sent it tomorrow. She already knew who had sent it. The following week, Riccardo Mancini came back. And then the week after that. Always charming. Always with that white smile. Always with a particular kind of attention that wrapped itself in politeness and carried something else underneath. The other staff noticed. Marco started angling to be the one to take his orders. The older cook, Piero, started finding reasons to linger near the kitchen door when Mancini was in the dining room. Angela handled it the way she handled everything, with composure, with boundaries that were clear without being combative, and with a faint, nagging awareness that each time Mancini's visits increased in frequency, something else was also increasing, an attention she couldn't quite locate. Small signs, inexplicable in isolation. The loose step at the staff entrance was repaired overnight, without anyone being called. The streetlight outside the restaurant, broken for months, was suddenly working again. A man she'd never seen before had been sitting at the counter of the coffee bar across the street 3 mornings running. Always there when she arrived, always gone by 10. She wasn't being watched in a way that frightened her. That was the thing she couldn't explain. It felt like being watched by something that had appointed itself her protector without asking permission. On a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the first reservation, her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Angela. The voice was unmistakable. Low, measured, each syllable placed with the care of a man who had learned that words were a kind of currency. She sat down on the edge of her bed. Mr. Ferraro, she said. Dante, he corrected, the same way she imagined he corrected everything, without force, but with complete expectation of compliance. How did you get this number? Does it matter? She thought about this. Yes, she said. A brief pause. Marco, he said, I'm sorry. That was overstepping. The apology surprised her more than anything else. It was offered plainly, without charm, without the softening that people usually added when they wanted an apology, to cost them nothing. What do you want? She said. I want to know if Riccardo Mancini has made any offer regarding the restaurant that makes you uncomfortable, Dante said, or any offer of any kind that you feel pressured by. Angela was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, Palermo hummed its nighttime sounds, scooters and distant music, and the smell of salt from the harbor 3 blocks away. Why? She said. Because I'd like to know. That's not an answer. Another pause. Longer this time. No, he said. It isn't. He seemed to consider something. Mancini is acquiring properties on Via Vittorio, using methods that aren't always voluntary. I have an interest in what happens in that neighborhood. An interest, she repeated. Yes. And that interest includes what happens to me personally? The pause this time was different, charged in a way that pressed against the silence between them. It's becoming that way, he said. Angela pressed her thumb against the edge of her phone case. Her pulse was doing something she didn't approve of. She was 29 years old. She had been taking care of herself since she was 16. She did not need a man who ran half of Sicily's underworld watching her street and buy her chef's knives and calling her at 11 o'clock at night to ask about her comfort. She also was not going to pretend she was entirely unaffected. He hasn't made any offers to me personally, she said carefully. He's made inquiries about the property to Barsetti. He's been coming in regularly. She paused. He's uncomfortable to be around. In what way? It wasn't a question. It was a specific, very quiet tone of a man who had decided he needed a precise answer. The usual way, she said. He looks at me like he's calculating something. The silence on the other end of the line had a texture to it now. She couldn't name it exactly. Dense. Controlled. I'll handle it, Dante said. I didn't ask you to handle anything. No, he agreed. You didn't. She waited. Good night, Angela, he said. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended. In her small apartment with its second-hand furniture and a stack of her mother's medical bills on the kitchen table, and tried to talk herself back to sensible ground. She was a waitress. He was a man whose name made restaurant owners sweat through their collars. Whatever this was, whatever small, inexplicable thing had begun to grow in the space between them, it was impractical and dangerous and almost certainly destined to end badly. She put the phone down on her nightstand. She did not sleep well. The next day, Riccardo Mancini did not come to the restaurant. He didn't come the day after that either. By the end of the week, the coffee bar across the street no longer had a man at the counter at 7 in the morning, because the man wasn't needed on the outside anymore. Something had shifted. Angela felt it without being able to name its cause. The street felt different. The staff relaxed in ways she hadn't realized they'd been tense. She didn't ask. She had enough self-knowledge to understand that asking would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean she'd already crossed some threshold she wasn't ready to name. But then came the Saturday that changed everything. It was peak dinner service. Every table full, the kitchen running at that controlled chaos that separates good restaurants from great ones. Angela was in her element, moving between tables with a smooth efficiency she'd spent years building, reading the room like a piece of music she'd memorized. She'd just cleared table 6 and was heading back to the kitchen when the front door opened and 3 men entered. Not Ferraro men. She knew the difference by now, the particular stillness of his people, the way they occupied space with contained precision. These men were different, younger, louder with their silence. 2 of them held the door, while the third walked in, and hid Riccardo Mancini's eyes in a harder face. She learned later his name was Sal Mancini, Riccardo's younger brother, and that Sal did not share his brother's preference for charm over threat. He stood in the center of the dining room, and the noise of the restaurant stuttered around him the way noise does when something wrong enters a space. He looked at Angela. "You're the one causing problems," he said, loudly enough that 2 nearby tables went completely still. Angela set down her tray. "I'm sorry. My brother's business here. You've been making things difficult." He took 2 steps forward. He wasn't a small man, and he used his size with the practiced deliberateness of someone who had spent years using it. "Maybe you need to understand that this neighborhood has new management." "Sir," Angela said, her voice absolutely level, "this is a dining establishment. I'd ask you to lower your voice." "I'll lower it," he said, and he was close enough now that she could see the edge in his eyes. Not passion, not anger exactly, something colder. "When you listen," and then everything happened at once. Angela, who had grown up in a house with a father who believed shouting was a form of communication, and who had spent 16 years learning every escape route from a room, shifted her weight to her back foot. It was pure reflex. The same reflex that caught Sal Mancini's wrist when his hand shot out toward the tray stand beside her, sweeping it in her direction. She wasn't a fighter. She had never thrown a punch in her life. But she had spent 3 years in a self-defense class after her father, and she knew how to move out of the way of something coming at her, and she knew how to redirect momentum, and the combination of Sal Mancini's own force and her stepping aside and the very solid edge of the tray stand was enough that he stumbled hard against the nearest table, sending 2 glasses of wine in spectacular arcs across the white tablecloth. The room went dead silent. Sal straightened. His face had gone a particular shade of red. Then the front door opened again. Dante Ferraro walked in. Behind him, Enzo and 2 others. He took in the scene in less than 1 second. The overturned glasses. The red-faced Mancini. Angela standing with her tray, completely still, expression arranged in something between composure and steel. Dante crossed the room. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. Every step was deliberate, and every person in the restaurant watched him make them without being able to look away. He stopped between Angela and Sal Mancini with a quiet, final positioning. The way you place something solid in front of something that needs protecting without drawing attention to the fact that that's what you're doing. He looked at Sal Mancini. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. That particular brand of quiet that only very confident and very dangerous men manage. With a lower the volume, the higher the weight of every word. "You have 30 seconds, Dante said, to leave this restaurant, return to your brother, and explain to him that the Via Vittorio properties are no longer available for acquisition. All of them." He paused one beat, "including this one." Sal Mancini stared at him. 25 seconds, Dante said. Sal left. The restaurant exhaled as one. Marco had appeared from behind the hostess stand and was already moving to assist the couple at the wine-splattered table with apologies and fresh linens. The low noise of normal evening resumed, cautious at first, then gradually warming back toward the sound of people enjoying themselves. Dante turned to Angela. She was looking at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. Clear, direct, and carrying underneath it something she was very carefully not saying. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I handled it." "You did." He looked at the tray still in her hands. Impressively, she set the tray down on the nearest surface. "How did you know to come?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer would require more than he was prepared to offer, standing in a dining room full of people who were pretending not to listen. "Enzo called me," he said, which was true and incomplete. She studied him. He let her. "Sit down," she said finally. "I'll get you a table." He almost smiled. It was becoming a habit around her, that almost smile, and he was aware of it in the way he was aware of most things that changed patterns in him, with wariness, with something uncomfortably close to wanting. She seated him at table 3, not the best table in the house, the second best, which he suspected was deliberate, and set Marco to take his order because she had 5 other tables to manage. But twice across the next 2 hours he looked up from his food and found her looking at him. Both times she looked away first. Both times he felt it like a pulled thread. A few days later, Angela went to visit her mother. Concetta Moreau lived in a ground-floor apartment in the Bolaro neighborhood, 15 minutes from Angela's place, and spent her days between physical therapy and the window where she watched the street with the quiet, philosophical attention of a woman who had learned that observation was one of the pleasures that remained when movement became difficult. She was 63, small, with Angela's same dark eyes and the slightly startled look of a woman who had never quite gotten used to the life that happened to her. Angela brought groceries and sat at the kitchen table while her mother made coffee and asked questions, which was the order of things. "You look distracted," Concetta said. "I'm tired," Angela said. "You're always tired. This is different." Her mother set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her with the deliberate movement of someone managing pain. "There's something on your mind." Angela turned her coffee cup in her hands. "There's a man," she said, because there was no point lying to her mother, who had radar for the thing Angela was trying to contain. Concetta waited. "He's complicated," Angela said. "Men always are," her mother said. "What kind of complicated?" Angela looked at her. "The kind you'd tell me to stay away from." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Is he kind to you?" The question was so simple and so precisely aimed that it caught Angela in the chest. "In the strangest ways," she said. Concetta picked up her coffee. "The strange kindnesses are the real ones," she said. "Any man can bring flowers. The ones who repair the step you've been meaning to fix for 3 months. Those ones you pay attention to." Angela stared at her mother. "Marco's mother is in my physical therapy group," Concetta said simply and sipped her coffee. Angela drove home in the particular silence of someone whose arguments with herself have just lost a significant amount of ground. The week that followed moved in a rhythm Angela couldn't quite settle into, too aware of too many things at once. She noticed the restaurant felt safer in ways she couldn't quantify. She noticed she'd started looking toward the door at the start of Saturday's service. She noticed that the card of the phone number which she had moved from her apron to her kitchen drawer to her bedside table, had been moved one final time to the small dish on her nightstand where she kept things she needed easy access to. She also noticed, on a Tuesday evening, a woman at table for who watched her with a particular kind of attention. Elegant, somewhere in her 50s, dressed in the way women dress when they want to project absolute authority without appearing to try. She had Dante's jaw, or something close to it, the same structural certainty. The woman's name, Angela found out later, was Carmela Ferraro, Dante's mother. She ate alone. She ordered well. She tipped generously. She said nothing to Angela beyond the normal exchanges of service. But as she left, she paused near the door and turned back, and her eyes found Angela with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. She gave a single, small nod. Then she left. Angela stood in the middle of the dining room with a water pitcher in her hand and the distinct, vertiginous sensation of being assessed by something larger than herself and not entirely failing the assessment. She called Dante that night. He answered on the second ring. "Your mother came to the restaurant today," she said. A pause. Then, with the careful tone of a man managing information he hadn't expected to need to manage so soon. "I see. Did you send her?" "No." He paused again. "I'm sorry if she didn't say anything." Angela sat on her bed. "She just looked at me." "That's how she says things," he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before in their conversations. Something looser, almost rueful. "She's been wanting to come since I mentioned you." The words landed quietly in the space between them. "You mentioned me," Angela said. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had returned to its usual measured register, but something underneath it had shifted. "Yes," he said, "I mentioned you." Angela closed her eyes briefly. The drawer of things she was trying to not acknowledge was getting very full. "Dante," she said. "Angela." "What is this?" she said. "What are we doing?" The silence lasted long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he said, "I'd like to have dinner with you, not in the restaurant where you work. Somewhere you're not carrying trays." He paused. "If you're willing." She should have said no. She had a list of reasons ready, neatly ordered, entirely sensible. The power differential, the danger of his world, the particular kind of attachment she could already feel building in her chest, like weather, the kind that, once it arrived fully, would be very difficult to clear. "Saturday," she said. "I'm off at 7. The dinner was at a small place on the waterfront, the kind of restaurant that had 12 tables and no menu on the wall, because the owner cooked what he caught that morning. Dante was already there when she arrived, standing outside, and he had not brought Enzo or anyone else, which told her something. She had worn a deep green dress with long sleeves and her grandmother's earrings. His eyes moved over her when she walked up and then returned to her face, and she watched the thing that happened in them. The thing she'd been watching for weeks now, the shift between the public man and whoever existed underneath him, and she felt in her sternum like a struck chord. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and the owner brought them wine and fresh bread and left them alone. For the first 20 minutes they talked about things that had nothing to do with anything that mattered. The food, the harbor visible through the window, a film she'd seen recently. He asked questions the way people ask questions when they're genuinely interested rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and she answered honestly because she found, to her slight alarm, that she couldn't find much reason to be guarded with him. He had already seen her at her most competent and most stubborn. There wasn't much left to perform. "Tell me about your mother," he said. So she did. She told him about Conchetta's accident 4 years ago, the long recovery, the bills that had reorganized Angela's entire life without asking permission. She told him about taking the restaurant job, which she'd intended to be temporary, and discovering she was actually very good at it in a way that surprised her. She told him about the self-defense classes. She told him, without quite meaning to, about her father and the house she'd grown up in and the particular kind of competence she'd built out of necessity. He listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes, without the anxious feeling of silence that most people do when they hear something difficult. When she finished, he said, "You're the most capable person I've met in a very long time." She looked at him. "You run an entire criminal empire." I know a lot of capable people, he said. Most of them are capable because they want something. Power, money, position. He turned his wine glass slowly. You're capable because the people you love needed you to be. He paused. That's different. She looked at him for a long moment. Tell me about yourself, she said. And don't give me the version you give people you're trying to impress or intimidate. He looked at her. How do you know I have another version? Because everyone does, she said. And because you've been not giving it to me for weeks now, and I'd like to see it. He was quiet. Then, slowly, with the particular care of a man unfolding something that hadn't been unfolded in a long time, he began to talk. He told her about his father, Dante Ferraro, who had been iron where it showed, and something entirely different at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, who had taught Dante chess at age 6 and told him every move in business, and life was only as good as the 3 moves after it, who had died when Dante was 29 and left him the way to a family in a city, and the particular loneliness of being the person everyone else's safety depended on. He told her about the loneliness of authority, about rooms full of people where he was entirely alone, about the particular silence of his house in the evenings, which he had stopped noticing years ago and had recently started noticing again. He didn't say why it had started again. He didn't need to. They both knew. The dinner lasted 3 hours. When they left, he walked to her car because the street was narrow and the evening had gone dark. They stood at her car door, and the harbor was visible at the end of the block, the water catching the city's light. He was looking at her in a way that made the air between them feel dense. Angela, he said. Don't say anything, she said quietly. Not yet. He understood. He stepped back. Not far, but enough. Saturday next week, he said. If you want. Yes, she said. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and her grandmother's earring still catching the streetlight, and she let herself, for exactly the length of the drive, feel the full weight of what was beginning. Then she put it in its proper place, which was not gone, not denied, but held carefully with both hands like something that mattered. The next 3 weeks moved the way early things move, forward, with a warmth underneath them that grew steadily. 2 more dinners. Phone calls that started at practical subjects and ended an hour later on topics neither of them could quite account for. Books she'd mentioned once and found left at the staff entrance. A detail he'd shared casually about a problem he was working through, and which he'd thought about, and texted him a genuine response to at 11 the following morning, to which he had replied immediately, which told her more than any declaration would have. She met Enzo properly, who treated her with the particular respect of a man whose opinion of her had been settled long before she realized she was being evaluated. She learned that Dante's house had a garden he never used and a library he used constantly. She learned he had a sister in Rome who called him on Sundays and was the only person on earth who could make him laugh without trying. She learned slowly the specific geography of a man who had been alone for so long that he'd furnished the solitude and called it preference. And she felt herself, against every sensible instinct she possessed, falling. Then the danger came, the way danger comes when you've allowed yourself to become visible. It arrived on a Wednesday morning in the form of 2 photographs delivered to Signor Barsetti's office. One was of Angela leaving Dante's car on a Friday evening 3 weeks prior. The other was of the 2 of them at the waterfront restaurant, visible through the window. Across the bottom of each photograph, in block letters, someone had printed a message. Tell your waitress to remember her place. Barsetti came to Angela white-faced and shaking. She looked at the photographs. She looked at them for a long time. This is connected to Mancini, she said. Angela, Barsetti said, I think you should. I'll handle it, she said. She called Dante from the back corridor, standing very still, her voice even. She told him what she was looking at. There was a silence on his end that had a texture she was learning to read. This one was not the controlled quiet of a man thinking. This was a particular stillness of a man deciding something. Don't go anywhere alone today, he said. I'll send Enzo. I don't need... Angela. His voice was quiet, just her name, but the weight of it pressed against her like a hand on her shoulder. Please. She said yes. Enzo arrived within 15 minutes and positioned himself at the coffee bar across the street. with the practiced invisibility of someone who had been doing this for decades. Angela finished her shift. Nothing happened. The day was entirely ordinary. That night she sat in her apartment and tried to feel afraid, and found instead that what she felt was angry at the photographs, at the implied threat, at the assumption that she could be moved by fear. Her phone rang. The photographs came from a man on Mancini's payroll. Dante said, "We've dealt with it." She didn't ask what dealt with it meant. She had made a decision some weeks ago about the parts of his world she could live alongside, and the parts she needed to not look at directly. And this was one of the second kind. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm angry," she said. "Good," he said. "I don't want to stop working," she said. "I don't want to change anything I do because someone sent photographs." "You won't have to." "I mean it, Dante. I won't be moved around like." "Angela." His voice was steady. "You won't have to change anything. I promise you." She breathed out slowly. "You sound very certain." "I am." She believed him. That was the thing that was still catching her off guard, the steady accumulation of instances in which he'd been exactly as good as his word. The step, the streetlight, Sal Mancini leaving without further incident. Every quiet, practical act of care that had required no announcement. "I'd like to see you," she said, and the words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. The silence on his end was brief and warm. "I'll come now," he said, "if you want." "Yes," she said. He arrived 20 minutes later. She opened the door, and he was standing in the hallway of her building with his jacket over one arm. And for a moment, they just looked at each other across the threshold, and the thing that had been building between them for weeks pressed against the moment like a tide. She stepped back. He came inside. Her apartment was small and entirely her. Books stacked on every surface with the cheerful disorder of someone who reads too many things at once. A good lamp she'd saved 3 months for because proper light mattered. Her grandmother's photograph on the wall above the kitchen table. The chef's knives and their leather roll on the counter. He looked at the knives. Something moved in his expression. "You kept them," he said. "They're the best knives I've ever used," she said. "Throwing them away would have been wasteful." He looked at her. "Is that the only reason?" She looked back at him. "No," she said. They sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, and she made coffee, because her hands needed something to do, and he watched her do it with a quiet attention she'd grown accustomed to, and when she set the cups down and sat, the kitchen felt smaller than it had before he'd entered it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. I haven't been frightened of anything in a long time." He turned his coffee cup. "Not in the way that matters. I've been careful, calculated. Those aren't the same as afraid." He looked at her. "I'm afraid of this." She was very still. "Of what this is becoming," he said. "Of how much it matters to me. Of losing it." He paused. "Of you deciding it's too much." She looked at him for a long moment, at the controlled, careful face of a man who had just handed her something unguarded. "Dante," she said softly, "I decided weeks ago that it was too much." She paused. "I'm still here." Something moved across his face that she'd never seen before. Relief, she thought, or the closest thing to it that he was able to show. He reached across the small table and put his hand over hers. It was deliberate, unhurried, and she turned her hand beneath his and held on. And the kitchen was quiet around them, and the city moved outside the window, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment. They didn't need to. What happened next, the closeness in the small kitchen, the way the evening moved from words to something deeper and quieter, the way two people allow themselves to finally stop negotiating with the thing they feel, belongs to them. It faded the way real moments do, not because they ended, but because some things don't need an audience, not even a narrator's. What stayed, what mattered, was the morning after. Angela woke early, the way she always woke, light coming gray through the window, the city not yet fully awake. She lay still for a moment. Then she remembered where she was and who was beside her, and the full weight of the previous night moved through her like a wave. And she panicked, not because of him, not because of anything he'd said or done, but because she was Angela Moreau, who had learned at 16 that the people she needed most had a way of leaving, who had built her entire adult life around needing nothing from anyone she couldn't provide herself, who had spent 3 years watching powerful men make promises, and 3 minutes watching them unmake those same promises the moment the promises became inconvenient. She looked at him still asleep, the lines of his face softer in the early light, and she felt the depth of what she felt for him like standing at the edge of something very high. And every part of her that was self-protective said, quietly and clearly, leave before he does. She got up carefully, got dressed, wrote nothing, left. She was at the restaurant by 6:30, 2 hours before her shift, and stood in the empty dining room in her coat and told herself it was fine, that it was right, that this was the sensible thing, that a man like Dante Ferraro, who had the entire city arranged around him, did not need a waitress with a stack of medical bills and a small apartment with second-hand furniture and a grandmother's photograph on the wall, that this morning had always been coming, and she'd simply been the one sensible enough to arrive at it first. She was convincing herself very effectively when her phone rang. She didn't answer. It rang again, then a text. Where are you? Not a question. 2 words, placed with the particular precision of a man who had woken to an empty apartment and understood immediately what that meant and was not accepting it. She put her phone in her pocket. She made herself a coffee in the empty restaurant kitchen and sat at the prep counter and looked at the wall and told herself she had made the right decision. 20 minutes later, the front door of the restaurant opened. She hadn't unlocked it. She had locked it behind her when she came in. Dante Ferraro walked through it anyway, because a lock on a door in Palermo was, for him, a formality rather than an obstacle. He was still in yesterday's clothes. He hadn't stopped to change. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her sitting at the prep counter with her coffee and her coat still on and her very carefully arranged expression. He crossed the kitchen. He didn't rush. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face with that complete, patient attention that had undone her from the beginning. Angela, he said. I thought it was better, she said, and her voice only wavered slightly. Better, he repeated, to leave. Before, she stopped. Before it gets harder. Before what gets harder? She looked at him, and because she was Angela, who had learned to be honest even when it cost her, she said the thing that was actually true. Before I need you too much to be sensible about it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put both hands on the counter on either side of her, not touching her, just surrounding the space, and his voice was very low and very certain. I woke up, he said, and you were gone, and I understood in that moment. The way you understand things that rearrange something in you permanently, that I do not want to go through another day of my life where you're not in it. He paused. Not as someone I watch from across the street, not as someone I call 11 o'clock, and want to say more than I say. He looked directly at her. I want you with me, whatever that means, whatever you need it to look like. I'm not asking you to walk into my world without your eyes open. I'm asking you to walk into it with me. She looked at him. Her eyes had gone bright in a way she wasn't doing anything about. Dante, she said, you don't have to leave first, he said quietly. I'm not going anywhere. She breathed out slowly, and then, because she was done arguing with herself and done being sensible about the things she felt for him, she leaned forward and put her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stayed like that in the early morning kitchen, while the city outside woke up and the light changed and the world moved forward into whatever was coming next. What was coming next, as it turned out, was real. The danger that arrived 6 weeks later was not a photograph or a young man with ambitions above his actual capability. It was organized. It was quiet. And it came from a direction that no one, not Enzo, not Dante's entire network, had anticipated. A family called the Barisi had been operating in Palermo for decades, careful and patient. The kind of organization that moved like water, finding the spaces between larger structures and making themselves essential to those structures without being visible. They had worked alongside the Ferraro family for 20 years. A functional arrangement, mutually beneficial. But something had changed in the past 6 months, a leadership shift within the Barisi family, a new voice making decisions, and that voice had looked at the current landscape of Palermo, at the shifting alliances, at the Mancini family's failed acquisitions, at Dante's particular distractions in a certain autumn evening in a restaurant, and made a calculation. Angela was the calculation. She didn't know this. She was having coffee with Enzo one Thursday morning in the restaurant before her shift, a thing they had fallen into over the past month, where Enzo drank his espresso and talked about nothing in particular and was, she had come to understand, actually checking that she was well, without either of them needing to acknowledge that that was what was happening. She didn't know that two men had been watching the restaurant for 12 days, that they had mapped her movements, that they knew she left by the staff entrance at 11:30 on Thursday nights after late service, that the street behind the restaurant had a 90-second gap in the camera coverage. She found out she wasn't going to her car at 11:30 when she turned into the back lane behind the restaurant and found them waiting. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Two men, a car, the particular code of understanding, without having been told exactly what was happening. She screamed once, loud and clear, because her self-defense teacher had told her that noise mattered, and she had remembered it, the way she remembered everything useful. She fought because she had the knives in her bag, and she had trained, and she was not, fundamentally, someone who stopped, not when it cost her, not when something important was at stake. She bought herself 45 seconds. It wasn't enough. The car door closed and the lane was empty. Enzo found the lane at 11:32. He had been inside the restaurant, finishing a conversation with Barsetti. 90 seconds. The gap in the camera coverage. Someone had planned this down to the minute. He called Dante before he'd finished processing what he was looking at. The phone rang once. What Dante said when he answered was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of a man in whom something has ignited that has no safe direction except forward. Find her, he said. Find her right now. What happened in the next 6 hours belonged to a different register entirely. The part of Dante Ferraro's world that existed behind the quiet and the tailored suit and the measured voice. Every resource, every contact, every favor owed across 20 years of the Ferraro name carrying weight in the city, and half a dozen others. Enzo coordinated from the car. Marco Ferraro, Dante's cousin and the family's most effective information gatherer, had 3 names within 40 minutes. The Barisi family's new decision-maker had a location, a property in the hills above the city, registered under a shell company, used for nothing on record. Dante drove himself. Enzo tried to argue. Once, "I drive," Dante said. Enzo sat in the passenger seat and said nothing further. There were 6 of them who went in. The property was not expecting a coordinated response this fast. It was expecting negotiations, demands, leverage being applied in the usual way, messages sent through intermediaries over the course of days. Instead, it got Dante Ferraro at 2 a.m, which was a different thing entirely. Angela was in a back room with a locked door and a single bulb overhead, sitting on a wooden chair with her knees drawn up and her hands in her lap. She was not crying. She was thinking. Specifically, she was thinking about the 90-second camera gap and who had known it existed, because that detail meant someone inside the restaurant's regular orbit had provided information, and she was working through the list with the calm, methodical attention of a woman who had decided that thinking was better than despair. She heard the door when it came off its hinges. She was on her feet before the sound finished. Then Dante was in the doorway. He crossed her in 3 steps and put both hands on her face and looked at her the way people look at things they've been afraid of losing, with a thoroughness that wanted to confirm every part was still intact. She looked at him, at the controlled face and the very uncontrolled eyes. "You drove yourself," she said. "Yes," he said. "Enzo hates that." "I know." She put her hands over his where they held her face. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm completely all right." He made a sound that was almost not a sound at all. Then he pulled her in and held her with the particular grip of someone who has just understood precisely what it means to almost lose something, and she wrapped her arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself, for the first time since the lane behind the restaurant, breathe. The Barisi matter was resolved. Angela didn't ask for details, and he gave her only the parts that were hers to know, that the decision-maker had been removed from the equation, that the arrangement between the families was renegotiated under terms that left no ambiguity, that Palermo, specifically the streets around Osteria Ferrante, was not going to present this problem again. She went to her mother's the next morning, sat at the kitchen table, and drank coffee, and told Concetta almost everything, edited to protect her from the parts that would keep her awake. Concetta listened. Then she said, "Does he love you?" Angela thought about the 6 hours. About a man who had driven himself. "Yes," she said. "Do you love him?" She looked at her coffee cup. "Yes," she said. "I do. Terrifyingly much."